spanning MSMEs, rural credit, and consumer BNPL. But so are the headwinds: regulatory tightening, rising NPAs, distribution friction, and an ongoing quest for sustainable unit economics. To unpack these dynamics, I'm thrilled to be joined by a panel of leaders who bring diverse and deep perspectives as founders, investors, and ecosystem builders shaping the future of financial services in India. Let me introduce our panelists. Vivek Bansal, former CFO at Incred and now founder at Sarthi, where he's solving last mile credit distribution. Vivek brings extensive experience across fundraising, lending, operations, and scaling credit platforms. Then we have Rajat Bansal, then Hachalated, Managing Director at Low Capital, a leading impact VC focused on early stage financial services. He brings a sharp lens on inclusion, scalability, and responsible growth. Then we have Nitin Chaudhary, the founder of Navdan, a rural fintech enabling credit access for underserved segments, farmers and micro businesses through technology and grassroots partnerships. And then we have Aparajit Bhandarkar, partner at Verenium VC, which backs fintech and lending infrastructure startups. He brings the investor's perspective in scalable, capital efficient models. So I can kickstart this panel now. So let's start broad, for all of you. What do you see as the most significant challenges and opportunities in India's lending ecosystem today? And maybe, we can start with Raja.
Volleyball. Thanks, Anushka. And Nitin, I think we changed your name a little bit, been restored back to Agarwal. So that's a very broad, open-ended question, Anushka. I think uh, in India, especially in a sector like financial services, there's a plethora of opportunities. There's still hundreds of problems that are unsolved. So if I take a long enough timeline, I will probably only see opportunities in this space. The challenges tend to be more short term and more medium term, often either linked to the cycle that we're in. So right now we're seeing a lot of elevated NPAs and credit costs, but any sensible operator, any sensible investor will take it in their stride as this being a part of the cycle. You have to be prepared ahead of time and deal with it. But in terms of uh, just thinking about the opportunities, I think we just scraped the surface. If I connect it to our own experience at Low Capital, the first 10 years of our existence, so say from 2005 to 15, we did a lot of work in microfinance, very small ticket, uh, through a group lending model. And increasingly, that model gained a lot of acceptance and culminated with a bunch of microfinance companies becoming banks. There's probably no other validation in this sector similar to becoming a bank. If now you see the last 10 years, 2015 till 25, lot of progress on secured lending, housing, MSME. Vivek has jumped into the fray himself. So very exciting times, still a lot of headroom, lot of action to come. And there are multiple other segments, I think, going forward that will become more relevant. So overall, very excited overall about this space and the opportunities it presents.
Vivek, we'd love to hear from you.
I think Rajat didn't talk about how they benefited from the challenges. I think he should speak about what kind of returns their funds are given because they are a financial services focused fund. Uh, in terms of, I think what I would say is that last mile connectivity is the key thing in India and how you actually service the customers at right cost. If you look at the lending pyramid for India, it's like a pyramid wherein top is banks, then you have larger NBFCs which probably cater to larger client metros. Then you have smaller NBFCs, right? And that is where last mile connectivity is really taking place. And then MFIs. Last mile connectivity is happening at this. And below that is money lenders. So I think graduating customers from money lenders to MFIs and then NBFCs and then banks, I think that is the challenge which we see in India and how we can bring people in the ecosystem, right? Uh, I don't know how much people realize, but schemes like Jan Dhan, right, and UPI, etc., these are helping in a big way to actually make people credit worthy. If you look at the evolution of the lending landscape, And Rajat touched on some of the entities and how they have kind of seen MFIs graduating to small finance banks, etc. But in reality, a lot of growth in the secured MSME space where we are actually going to operate has actually happened in last 8-9 years. And that actually coincides with some of the initiatives which have been taken by Government of India, uh, which I think is very, very important, because unless the funding you're getting at a right price, it is very difficult for a business person to really scale up. Funding is actually a raw material for anyone. So I would say, I mean, these challenges actually offer a lot of opportunities, more opportunities than actually challenges, because given the demographic profile which our country has, it actually is actually wonderful. I mean, not just from a consumer space perspective, but what growth we can have overall is just phenomenal, right? So I actually feel that we are at the cusp of something big in the country on many counts. Government talks about how we can get to a 10 trillion economy, and if you have to get to a 10 trillion economy, financial services have to play a big part. Imagine what we have done in 75 years. We are like a 4 trillion economy. So imagine 4 to 10, what will happen? So that is the kind of scope which is there. So I think challenges I would underplay. It's more opportunities.
Thanks for that, Vivek. I'd love to hear from you because Navdan is operating at the rural edge. So, when a borrower, say, has no credit history, how do you access them? What do you do?
So I think there's a lot of misconception about how the rural markets look like or the last mile look like. And glad you asked that question. So that gives me an opportunity to clarify on that. One of the misconceptions is that the rural folks don't have enough credit history. In fact, the converse is true, which is that rural folks have much more credit history than typically urban folks. We in our practice, where we lend to rural small businesses in deep interiors and actually rural areas, and we don't want to call it as tier 1, 2, 3 towns, they are deep rural areas. The credit histories are pretty rich. And one of the ways we use, to enrich it further is that we go beyond just the proprietor of that rural small business. We look at all the adults in the household. We also expand the scope of looking at credit history, not just from the consumer credit bureau standpoint, but also looking at the micro bureau, which has even richer data than the consumer bureau and the enterprise bureau. Quite often people do not appreciate that there's almost a 30% overlap between the three sets of bureau data. Having said that, there is a general huge improvement in the digital footprints of the rural population. So just to give you a couple of numbers, we started out about 5 years ago when the penetration of smartphones in rural India was roughly about 10 odd percent. Now, in our latest assessment, we see that has grown gradually to about 70%. So 70% of rural households today have access to smartphones. And the days are not far where it would become more or less universal. The second data point I would suggest is the usage of data itself on the smartphones. So that also is increasing as we go ahead. And, some of these solutions which India Stack brings in, like the UPI and others, have made life easier. And of course, the telecom connectivity improving has been another, saving grace. So it's not been difficult from a credit history standpoint to assess the borrowers. The other issues around distribution costs, those stay intact.
Got it. No, that's helpful. Just, since you brought this up, everyone's talking about AI and ML and alternate data. Maybe Rajat, we can start with you on this. How are you seeing this play out in the lending landscape?
Should we get Aparajit to start first?
Yes. Maybe Aparajit, you can take this one first.
Actually, yeah. I'm a little bit of dinner, but it's it.
Yeah, so I think broadly in the lending space, I think there is an opportunity to build. The challenge on the lending side is that most of the unbanked area is actually the SME space, and the challenge with SME is twofold. One is that the cost of rendering the credit, which is originating the loan, managing the loan relationship, and then managing collections, is higher than some of the banked segments like corporate and mid market segments. So, effectively, what happens is that anything that can reduce the cost of that service becomes critical. AI with, where recently over the last 4 5 years have actually achieved what you call as many a times, if you take something called a Turing test, where you can't detect whether it's a computer or it's a human on the other side. I think more or less the Turing test has been broken some years ago. And today, AI is able to render multilingual, sort of data answers for a lot of things, and able to reduce costs considerably. The cost differential between an AI and a human can be one is to 50 or 1:100 effectively as you scale up. So that's going to be a big play as we go forward, both on the side of onboarding customers, doing KYC, doing customer service, maybe even collections, because collections, a lot of automation can happen on the really microcredit side. So that's a little bit on from my side.
So, to service the segment of Google small borrowers, we built a tech platform called ASEN. ASEN was essentially supposed to have the customer journey and the lender journey both on a tech platform. We had been building it for the last 5 years, and we just closed around and we started re-looking at ourselves afresh. And today I can tell you, in 1 week past our product reviews, we are in a situation that I have a 50-member tech team, and it's like a proper tech organization with an engineering head, a DevOps head, and you name them and there's a full organization structure. And we realized that some of the agentic AI solutions are so effective that a lot of work that was being done by the developers, and we've gone beyond the co-pilot stage now, is actually happening on the agentic AI workflows. We were in Google 2 days ago in their office, and they were also surprised at what we are doing and looking at collaborating to build something in the public infrastructure side. So it's not just looking at what the output service is, but also to building for those services. There is a massive surge where things are getting easier, but you need to get the right LLM models to do that.
Rajat, we'd love to hear from you, especially what's playing out on the ground, right? So if you can share any examples of your company.
So I can think of two very interesting examples that we have seen in our portfolio companies more recently. So one of these companies, it's a fintech. They they primarily run a personal loan product. So obviously in that product, in this market, you see a lot of delinquencies. They have introduced AI bot for pre-delinquency calling. So this is before a customer has moved to any kind of overdue bucket or LBS. The call that typically goes from a call center to remind the customers to pay the EMI on time is now being done for a test case of customers through a chatbot, not a chatbot, a voice bot. And the company ran a sample back test to go back to that customer set. 68% of the customers could not identify that they're talking to a bot, but felt that they're talking to a real human. I was quite surprised at the outcome of the survey. I would have thought it's easy to pick when you're talking to a bot. So that will obviate at scale. That kind of a solution will really remove the need for having a large call center, because a lot of that can be done through the AI itself. Similarly, another one of our companies is using uh, a solution for training of field officers, because you hire sales officers in large numbers. They have employed a virtual trainer that is AI driven. So you can feed it a script of what the training is supposed to be, and it will speak like a real person, to some extent pause when there is a question. They are supplementing it with an actual trainer who can take the questions, but a large part of the training can be really standardized and delivered across various geographies by using this solution. So both very interesting use cases. I'm also taking more of a interest to see how these evolve, because these are very real savings that you start seeing on the operating expense side of things. And once these start operating at scale, I think you can really look at the economics of these products differently.
So, Vivek, as you're building Sarthi, we'd love to know how you're thinking about this.
I think it's a very, very interesting topic, and coincidentally today morning itself, lot of us were brainstorming in our office, and the topic was this: that how we can use AI in tech development. I mean, taking a lead from what Nitin was mentioning about the tech team, when we are actually working in a very different manner, that how we can have just a 15-member team, right? And how we can use AI to kind of make it more cost effective. I personally feel that the tech cost will probably reduce by half over time, but this is still at experimental stage. You probably will spend a lot more before it becomes half, because you will have to invest that money. Just to give you some examples in terms of how we are probably thinking about AI, looking at AI, like developers you mentioned. I mean, our CTO feels that we probably don't need developers, maybe just one, because coding is becoming so much easier, right? That you don't need that regular run of the mill skill set, right? So that is where AI will come into play. Where AI will further come into play is how you actually analyze a customer, right? So there are very many things you can do through AI. Like when you are asking them to download the app, I mean, which some people may call it AI, some people may call it that, yes, this is more a tech kind of data science related thing you're doing, but everywhere there is some interface of AI, and how you actually see that what customer is doing every day, where he is going, what time he is reaching his house, that can be an input for your collection team. So like he was talking about chatbot, right? That people are not realizing. Here today, when the customer has downloaded our app, we know what time he goes to his shop, we know what time he goes to his house, right? And that is a very important input in collection, because when a person delays or defaults, the first to reach is first to collect. Typically, they will avoid taking your calls, but you know what time he's at home, so your collection guy will do at that time. I mean, it's intrusive, but this is how tech will shape the world going forward. Quite a few companies are doing this. I'll give you another example that how we are trying to kind of think about reducing TAT. I mean, all these are right now stories because we are in the implementation phase, and time will tell how much we are able to implement. But what we are doing is a sales guy when he's going to a customer, and we are talking about a customer who takes loan from 5 to 20 lakhs. I'm not talking about a evolved customer who is probably sitting here. It's all tier 2, 3 towns. When he's going there, he will ask some questions. Typically, a sales guy is a graduate or a BCom or kind of a little bit experience, maybe 1 year. He would not have that much experience in terms of how to probably ask all the questions. So he will take basic information, go to office, credit person will tell him that there are following things I need more. Credit person will go. Now here you can actually record everything. When a sales guy is there with the customer, just start recording. Everything will record in terms of conversation that actually will prepare your credit assessment memorandum. All the questions which he has to ask will actually be prompted to him that you need to ask these questions. So the standard questions you can ask and that can result in reduction of turnaround time. All this actually reduces the operating cost, and the last mile, whatever interest you give, eventually will get better. Right? So today the cost of servicing for these customers is very high. I mean, at a scale, you are talking about maybe 4% OPEX. And when you're not at scale, you're talking about maybe 7, 8, 10%. Now, government talks about reducing interest rate for them, right? Now, if you borrow at 10 and 10% is your OPEX, you can't give below 20. Right? Now, that can only happen if you are reducing your OPEX. And to me, AI, I think, is something which will add a lot of value in reducing your OPEX in many, many ways. I mean, tech is an example I took. I took an example of how my sales guy and credit can probably collaborate. If my turnaround time is reducing, that means he can actually get more cases during a month. Right? So his cost is getting apportioned over more cases. So I think we are in for interesting times. We talk about having young people in tech team and data science team or interns, right? Because most of us sitting here, I don't think we generally understand what AI is, right? We can talk, we can read, but it's the young population who actually really understand what you can do. So it is very important that you have those interns who are fresh from college, where they'll be having fresh ideas, and just listen to them and then try and implement. You're actually seeing benefits of those. We have a lot of interns right now, and we probably have equal number of interns currently in our head office as kind of we have employees, right? So, I mean, we probably are quite bullish on this thing, that this is something which is going to add EA value.
So I think the common theme here is improving collections, increasing productivity, and therefore reducing costs, right, across all four. Okay. I think maybe we can move a little to the RBI, because that seems to be a topic on everyone's mind. What's your take? Maybe we'll start with you about it. What's your take on RBI's evolving regulatory posture? Do you think it's helping the industry or slowing down innovation?
I'm actually happy with RBI. Generally, they've been okay. I mean, we can expect something more, but that's what they are, and that's what their job is, to make sure that things are all right. And the fintech space, if you honestly ask me, uh, we'll have fintech entrepreneurs disagree with me, but overall, there have been lots of transgressions by a lot of entrepreneurs, and some of them RBI wrap their knuckles, and then you're in various fintech chat groups, and everyone, uh, you know, uh, will show one sad face when RBI comes out with one more new regulation. But people have ended up doing quite a few stupid things, and suddenly RBI comes back and says that sorry, you can't do this, and there are enough VC funds which basically have put in hundreds of millions of dollars into this. So if you see some of the larger VC funds, they've actually worked on transgressing laws to make money, and this come from the fact that back in the day, people have made money. Facebook's logo was move fast and break things. Uber's idea was that we will break laws and then make money. We will destroy taxi unions in cities and make money. And BC funds have made money with that. Now they come into India with financial services and then decide that we are going to do something which is slightly stretching the limits and boundaries of regulation. And RBI comes and tells them, sorry, you're wrong, and shuts down the business, and that they should live with it. Well, that's my view. I mean, it can be controversial. That's what I.
No, thanks for sharing your thoughts. Rajat, we'd love to hear from you as well.
I don't have such a negative view of large VC. Although for the most part, I also don't like large VCs. But as far as RBI is concerned, largely I agree with Aparajit's view as well. The objective that the RBI has been set up with is first and foremost stability of the financial system. So if I evaluate them on that as being the key parameter, I would say they have actually taken care of the overall sector and the financial sector quite well. We come out of most of our crisis very quickly, and the sector bounces back, if not in 12 then 18 months at the most. So just that resilience, a lot of credit obviously to the entrepreneurs and the people in the field doing the work, but some credit to the RBI as well, that they keep the guardrails in place so people don't overboard. Now, if you evaluate them in innovation, I would think that's probably not their DNA. It's not what they've been set up for, but they've been tasked with that role as well. So they do something, they get somewhere, but I don't think, I don't expect a lot from RBI when it comes to pure play innovation. But when you set up new entities like an NPCI, when you set up new bodies that will give you results and build on the efforts of RBI, that's always very useful. So just a quick aside, if you look at UPI, for instance, one of our advisors is in fact on the board of NPCI, and he's writing a book on the evolution of UPI. So you would think UPI was launched in 2016, so work would have started a few years before, and that's the story of UPI. But he was telling me the deeper that he's gone into that work, he's traced the evolution of UPI back to 1991, when the RBI governor was C. Rangarajan, who made the first efforts towards financial inclusion, ran a few pilots, adopted a district, said, I will make this district cashless. This is back in the early 90s. Effectively, the UPI is an outcome of all the efforts over 25 years and finally culminating into a platform that works. So those kind of things are obviously, these are long projects. You have to stick with it and deliver results. We are probably the first economy, large economy in the world that has practically become cashless or is headed in that direction. So to that extent, I think I can't fault the RBI for doing the job they do.
Okay, that's great. So both of you can't fault the RBI. Vivek,
It's also the safe answer, right?
yeah, of course. I think Vivek, you want to skip this question, or do you have?
No, I think I'm a big fan of RBI, so I don't need to skip this. I think I agree with what Rajat is saying in terms of some of the innovations. RBI's main job is to make sure that there are no exits. Right? I genuinely feel that they have done a wonderful job. RBI has come a long way from where they were, and which is the evolution for anyone. And as a regulator, if you look at the incidences which have happened in the past, how they handled, I mean, between them and government both, the Yes Bank thing, right? I mean, it's not a joke, right? It's absolutely something which you won't find a parallel globally, right? What they have done on UPI, right? People will say NPCI did it, but RBI has been very collaborative and supportive. ULI, which is a new thing which probably is happening now. I probably feel that as a regulator, they are doing far more innovation than many regulators over the world are doing. I mean, let's go around and look European regulators. Probably nobody would want to work there. I mean, there are banks which have actually practically shut, right? Our regulator is actually a step ahead in the curve, I would say. Sometimes we as kind of operators of a company may not like some of the things, but they are looking at overall sector health. They are not looking at individual companies. So for example, when the unsecured lending growth became quite a lot, or gold prices went up and they actually recently reduced the LTV, right? And in between they nudged that let's reduce some bit of unsecured euphoria. I mean, all this was for a good reason. There is a data which they had on how people are borrowing and using that money. I mean, Dream 11. I mean, do you think people should borrow and use it on that? But RBI has data which they feel that is going towards those things. Stock market. Somewhere that leveraging will actually come and haunt people. So I think for what they are supposed to do, they are doing a brilliant job. I mean, I would use no other word. I think that is also, if you look at some of the award our regulator has received over the last 3 years, I mean, they probably received the top award in the world on the best regulator. I mean, these things are not publicized because it's a regulator. It's always good to kind of bash the regulator and talk things where that they are not supporting things. But I genuinely believe that they're really, really good. I mean, I'll take our own example in terms of license process. It was very smooth. I mean, I'm not biased because of that. I mean, we probably got it in very good time. So, I mean, you just honestly can't fault. Innovation is not something they're supposed to do, but still they do a lot more than most people would. So I would give them full marks on how things have been handled.
Thanks. You have any thoughts on this, Navin?
Well, I can just say, tell me how many regulators in the world have a sandbox. Tell me how many regulators in the world have an innovation hub. In fact, I would say RBI is one of the most advanced regulators compared to the regulation that you see around the world. And, Vivek did mention about European regulators. I think they're probably all retired fellows, so they don't want to work as much as our RBI folks would like to work. There are occasional difficulties, which I'm sure our CA fraternity is always there to help in doing their own interpretations and guiding their customers on. At the same time, one point I do want to make on RBI is about the spirit of law versus the letter of law. I think RBI is extremely clear about the spirit of law. It's the creative people, and one of the class of creative people is what Aparajit mentioned, who have tried to interpret the letter of law in such a way that it becomes like driving in a wrong lane. When you have a speed barrier, let's say you're driving on a highway which says 100 kilometers per hour is your speed barrier, but you want to drive at 10 kilometers an hour or 150 kilometers an hour, it can be dangerous for the system. So I think to that extent, I would say RBI is not that proactive to control the traffic. There are a lot of areas that we already know which RBI is working on where regulation is going to get tightened. I would fathom they happen faster. There are a lot of spaces where regulation tightening is required. I hope it happens faster, because then the disciplined players would benefit, and it is the rogue players which will get cleaned out in the market.
All in all, everyone's happy with the RBI regulations. So I think my last question for this group before we open up to the audience, looking 2-3 years ahead, what's one trend, customer segment or innovation you're most bullish of in the lending space?
Yeah, so we've put money in 4 companies. I'm assuming my choices of this thing are speaking. So we've got one company which is doing, which is Nitin's firm, which is doing MSME lending in deeper rural areas. So I think that opportunity is large, because I think India itself, 40% of the GDP comes from, and correct my numbers because I'm not fully correct on the numbers, but 40 odd percent of GDP comes from MSME, but credit to MSME will be more like 16, 17%. And so there is a lot of gap there, and there is an opportunity to build it. That's the first one. We've done something in the solar space where rural solar is an interesting opportunity where the grid is not available in rural areas. And, if you generate diesel electricity, is 35 rupees a liter, 35 rupees a kilowatt, and solar is at 5 rupees. So there's a lot of saving which can be captured in form of a little bit of interest, and for the people who are availing those facilities are happy. I think Open is going to be another big opportunity. The RBI is driving the ULI framework, and Open is a semi-regulated sort of body which is being set up by Spirit, which is going to make this SME lending interesting. So those are the areas and housing, we put a little bit of money in housing, but I would think most of the opportunity is in the SME space, given the amount of gap that's there in the lending space. So I guess like one at just politically.
So from my perspective, I'll just take so we are discussing a lot of retail and very similar stuff. The way I see it a little ahead, since you asked a little futuristic question, is that if you look at India, the secondary markets on the equity side are very developed, right? So you have a very, very good stock exchange. NSE is now coming up for listing. But the debt asset markets in India are very shallow. There's no trading of debt equity security or debt securities that happens, right? I would imagine that in next 5 years, we have a unit of NSE which is large enough or is starting to envy what trading happens on the equity side. And we have a lot of securities which are debt securities which start getting traded so that the debt asset markets become deeper and deeper. Today, the debt asset markets, and Vivek did allude to that initially, is a hierarchy where you have banks at the top, and then you have the NBFCs in a certain tiers. And there are only 60 companies in India which are more than 50,000 crores of total asset under management. That needs to be a little more democratized, right? So investors are ready. Probably retail investors are not as unaware of debt asset pools. I think next 5 years we should see an absolute explosion of debt asset pools in India.
Thanks for that take. Different take.
I think if I look back maybe 4 or 5 years and see what happened in these 4 or 5 years, and that can be extrapolate it for next 2-3 years, it's generally very difficult in terms of picking one thing which probably will be a real innovation which can really change the shape of the industry. I see a lending ecosystem as a building block of many things. I think the foundation is your liabilities, which I think we have seen some innovations in the last 4 or 5 years, co-lending as a framework. And I think it's a genuine long-term framework which has been brought in by the government and Reserve Bank, which is actually doing wonders for health of NBFCs. Then you have assets. Then you have your operating cost. So very many factors. I think ULI is something I'm watching very keenly, and how it changes many things over next 2-3 years. Because that what ULI means is that you probably will have property records. I mean, if you go to different states, India is a culmination of 28 different countries, right? And you can add union territory even more. Every state has different regulations on how property is actually registered or property has to be seen. I think some of this actually, if it gets unified in terms of how lenders can look at that, that probably can result in reducing the ultimate delivery in terms of cost to the ultimate borrowers, right? So ULI is something I'm closely watching, and we touched upon the AI thing. So that I think in next 2-3 years should probably help NBFCs in controlling OPEX. So overall, I think with a mix of these factors, I hope something will go to the real borrowers, and there is genuine benefit which filters now. Really can't say one item, but it will be many things which probably keep coming in. Even if you go about 10 years, you won't be able to pinpoint one item. Payment ecosystem obviously has been something which has been a watershed thing in the industry. And payment ecosystem, I think, would be number one in the world. Forget, I'm just thinking about our own country. So many things will happen. Difficult for me to do a crystal ball gazing. I'm not probably a astrologer, so I can't really do that. Thank you.
Rajat, you can do some crystal.
So yeah, sometimes investors try to do astrology and predict the future. So if I I have to pick a couple of trends, I think. So MSME obviously as a space, lot of opportunity, lot of growth to come. But if I wear my investor hat, once everyone realizes the opportunity, then your alpha disappears from that opportunity. So in some sense, you have to be looking ahead and planning for what might be the big opportunities, say 5 or 10 years down the line. A couple of areas I've been spending a bit more time on. So one area I'm very excited about, but I don't think as an industry we've cracked it completely, is the area of lending for domestic higher education. We have built companies, we have seen companies in the study abroad segment. We've had edtechs that have gone up, gone down, largely focused on coaching, tuition, some of those areas. But if you're talking about India becoming a 10 trillion economy, that cannot happen without a large young workforce that is trained in technical subjects, including accountancy, but also engineering, B school, medical. So those are, and today the top tier institutes, you have enough banks chasing students for giving out loans, but you have this large number of student population that will be in, say, institutes ranked 50 to 250, where no one is interested in doing the lending. So that if you're able to pick out the good kids, ambitious kids who will make a career in these markets and then back them with credit, I think that is going to be a huge opportunity that's going to come up. Another one that a bit of a pet project I've been working on is just trying to see within lending and within NBFCs, how can collections become more specialized and more effective? Because historically it's just been the approach has been to throw people at the problem or set up call centers. They will either indiscriminately call customers or people will start visiting and arm twisting customers. But it's a much more sophisticated activity than just following up. So can you build a more project based approach to debt management, to collections management? Be smart in knowing where you need to do a call, where you need to send a legal notice. Outsource or sell off some of that book to specialist providers who can do the job better, because large part of the NBFC business is sourcing and underwriting. So some combination of that will make the market a lot more mature when it comes to collections as an activity. So a couple of areas, Anushka, where I think a lot of action to come and we're quite optimistic about. Still looking for the right models on how to crack.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. I think we can open it up to the audience if you have any questions for the panelists, in case anyone has any question.
Yeah, I would like to ask Vivek Pansaji that about the P2P lending business in India. I think initially it was very fancy that investors started attracting towards P2P, as I was also there, one of them. But after a few years, we realized that it has become very black box where you do not know whom you are lending, right? And the promoters or maybe the company or the people running that business are mostly in touch with those borrowers, right? And I saw that there was huge like the losses to the investors because of this. So how do you see this entire business of P2P lending where these lenders are not in touch with the borrowers and they don't know like how they are going to recover their investments?
So I think you have fundamentally answered the flaw in the business model. And let me actually make one disclosure. My wife also started or co-founded a peer-to-peer lending company. So I know what the industry has gone through. There is a fundamental flaw in that, which is basically that there is no skin in the game of the company, it's platform. Right? And when you are doing a credit assessment, if you don't have a skin in the game, you're not really going to pay that much attention. You are interested in your commission. nobody cares about what is happening to an investor. Now, look at how peer-to-peer lending company works. There is a one side you have to get a borrower, right? And one side you have to get some investor who is actually giving. Why RBI has been really kind of cautious in this space is for these reasons. No skin in the game. Now, nobody knows who is lending to whom, right? So you can't really hold anyone's neck, right? Who does RBI go to? If they go to the company, they will say, fine, we connected, we had our platform, we actually highlighted the risks, right? Now it's up to the investor, right? And the investor is also a smart investor because he is probably investing good amount of money, right? So it is assumed that he knows what he is getting into, right? Scalability again is an issue. Now, people who are investing, right, they actually don't see anything. They are kind of relying on them. And you probably outlined that investors have actually not made good money, which is because it has not scaled up. There is no investment, right? Non-balance sheet play. Really difficult for such platforms to scale up. I mean, look at global examples. Why it came up in India? It came up very late, right? Some companies were successful in US and UK and China as well. And most of them have actually gone to bust, right? And it is for a reason. So I personally think that you already have NBFC licenses. What you have to do, you can do in that because all the fintech players, right? They can get the loan, put some balance sheet on play in terms of equity, and they can sell that loan. It is no different. Instead of selling to individuals, and Nitin was mentioning about debt market is not evolved in India. This is like one step below debt market, right? So first we have to actually work on debt market where people can invest. This is a sort of a debt instrument, nothing else. So very difficult market in my views, and something where regulator will have difficulty really regulating. So for them, they have to be cautious.
Hi, my name is Vikas Murarka. I wanted to check about the credit cost in the tech ecosystem. You mentioned about the operating cost being 4 to 7%. I wanted to check about the credit cost, how those numbers look like. Thank you.
So, sir, it will depend on what kind of business or product you're looking at. So, typically you will see the credit cost annual basis in the range of say 1 to 3%. If it's a down cycle, there is more risk in the market, it will be at the higher end. In a good cycle, when you're seeing a lot of growth, probably 1.5% at the top end, but highly variable depending on what product you're running and then how are you pricing it. So a 3% credit cost, if I take a home loan at 8.5 or 9%, that's unimaginable. But there is a segment of population taking personal loans at 20%. There you will see a 3-4% cost. So ballpark, it will be low single digits, but there you'll need to add a lot more nuance to which company or segment you're looking at.
Yeah, thank you. Add something to what Rajat mentioned. I mean, I think if you look at credit cost pre-GFC or 2008, the bureaus came into play, and post the bureaus came into play, right? There has been a world of difference. And I think COVID probably did a stress testing in terms of what credit costs can come in retail segment. Corporate, there have been many back testing which have been done in many ways, right? Largely maybe governance related. I think what you have to understand is in our country in the retail segment, niyat ka issue nahi hai, it's more financial discipline. Niyat ka issue is with larger loans, not with smaller loans. So by default, if you look at the bureau data, right, you will find that retail loans which are smaller actually have lower credit costs than the larger loans, right? And unsecured to unsecured and secured to secured, right? Keep aside home loan because that's a very different category. And hence, as Rajat also highlighted, credit card also has to be looked in the context of your yields, right? So there is no one size fits all answer to a credit cost. But I would say a range would be 0.5 to maybe 7-8%, right? But medium will be about 1 to 2% is what you will end up with eventually.
My name is Vittal. When government is talking about the 5 trillion, the economy, you are talking about the 10 trillion economy. Okay. Going the line where you see the India will be the 10 trillion economy. And the secondly, when today's India is a developing country, the interest rate is around 10 and 12%. Once it's developed country, the interest rate might be 1 and 2%. Then how you will sustain in that scenario?
Sorry, what difficult question. Honestly, I'll attempt. I mean, there are developed economies currently which probably are trading at equal to developing economies bond rates, right? So it's not as simple. I think it's a very nuanced topic in terms of develop versus developing. Not something which probably can be discussed in a forum or a answer which probably could be as simple as this. We have experts like probably Pawan sitting here who look at public market. They'll probably be able to answer it much better, because in public markets you probably need to look at that data much more. But let me just outline on the 10 trillion you spoke about. I mean, what government also outlines is just a mathematics, right? You can also do it on Excel. If our nominal growth rate is assumed 12, 13, 14, whatever is the number 10, you probably do a CAGR on that, and that is the year you will get. Now, whether you put 12, 10, 11, 14, that will change the year significantly, because the compounding works very differently, right? So I think I'll not comment on when we will be 10 trillion economy, because I'm not probably qualified to do that. But it's more a mathematical formula which you can apply, which probably will give you that. But one thing, as I outlined earlier, I think for us to become that, financial services will have to play a big role. For any economy now, you took an example of developed countries. I mean, the financial ecosystem there is far more developed. And the debt market has to develop a lot, which Nitin alluded to. I think that is one of the missing pieces in terms of what we need to really actually go there. Right now, we are dependent on foreign money, right? And I have investors who are foreign money, right? So we are dependent on foreign money. Domestic money is still very minimal, right? So debt market development is actually essential, as I see. We see your demat folio increasing, people probably investing more in equities. We are still at the tip of the iceberg in my views, right? Pawan, probably you can chat separately. He'll probably tell you what he believes, but yeah, I would say it's a very nuanced topic.
Hi, this is Manish Lalwani here. I have a question to Vivek. Vivek, you just mentioned that the larger loans default most of the times, and the smaller ones don't. At the same time, previously you also mentioned that P2P is not the best business that we are witnessing in this era. I'm an investor in one of the P2P platforms, and I was given to understand that the lending happens based on credit scores. So don't you think that is kind of taking care of a lot of credit issues that may arise? Point number one. Point number two. So I got a company that I've invested in. They are tied up with several companies of where customers would require those sums. For example, somebody who wants to take a course from Upgrad, or somebody who wants to even use LifeCell or LiveSpace and things like that. So yeah, I just wanted your views. If the credit scores are something to look at, then isn't that a safe investment?
A very relevant question. So I think credit is one part of how a customer life cycle is managed, right? So in this segment, as I mentioned earlier, niyat ka issue hai. Niyat ka issue nahi hai, financial discipline ka issue hai, right? Now that financial discipline issue, what it does is the bounce rates. So when you have to pay the EMI, the bounce rates are close to 20% plus. Now what that means is that you need to have someone to chase the customer. If you're not chasing, you're not collecting. That is where the problem comes in this, right? When you don't have a skin in the game, you don't have that ecosystem of collection team, right? You don't really focus on that ki ye abhi immediate jaake leke aana hai, right? And the ticket size is too small in that compared to what it should be. It actually comes closer to MFI. And MFI segment is a very different segment in terms of how it is managed in terms of last mile delivery as well as collections. So the issue really is not credit evaluation. That a lot of people can probably do based on a lot of business rule engine which they can fit in their systems, right? But it is more about managing the life cycle after that. So that is one part of that question in terms of why that is probably not happening that way. Second part you mentioned is they probably do these upgrades and all, and I also mentioned similar thing, that there are a lot of fintechs who are doing similar work. So why do you need an individual to take that risk? We don't have even our debt market develop, which probably is little more safer, right? So same thing, you can buy PTCs, right, which probably are kind of much safer, right? But how many people buy PTCs? No. I mean, I don't think anyone here would be really buying PTCs. PTCs probably are much safer, but even that democratization has not happened. So the debt market development, when that happens, when a retail investors start buying PTCs, right, that is I think what should happen, right? See, this P2P, while I mean, you can optimize many things on the cost front and just do things through platform, but the legs to lending are many. It starts with sourcing, which probably is coming there. And please understand, the customer will come on the P2P platform will be someone who has not got from someone else. Otherwise, there are many NBFCs running after customers, right? So he is coming to you on his own, right? That first filter itself is a red signal. So you need to do more filtration. So there are many nuances on P2P. I think over time, it may be a good thing for wealth management firms to own, to diversify their customers, I would say a wealth, how they manage the wealth, and maybe allocate small sum of money. But they will still need to develop a good kind of team who probably takes care of collections and credit well. Then it can probably be a good source of diversification on investments.
Thanks, Vivek.
This P2P thing, you know, if you're just lending to someone, what you're doing is you're sourcing the loan, assessing the credit risk, and collecting and doing a few other things. When you're saying P2P, you are actually assuming that I as a lay person am going to be able to do this better than someone who has been doing this in a banking framework or has been doing this in an NBFC framework over periods. What the NBFC or the bank is taking is a 3% spread broadly. You're saying that I'm going to be able to do this myself and I'm going to save on that 3% spread. And also what the NBFC or the bank brings is about 10 to 15% of capital adequacy, which protects you from both sides. So you're saying he's saving the 3%, but I'll do this better. No one does that. I mean, take for example, if I have a toothache, I won't take my plier and pull out my tooth. You're doing exactly that. Some people say, there's this angel networks which have been set up and they go and market these startups. You can also invest into a startup. They'll show 20 startups to you. And then, suddenly I've gone to various parts of India and met people, and people have told me, we invested through an angel fund and all the investments are bad. And I look up at them and say, boss, you're telling me that I do this 24 hours a day thinking of how to make money. And suddenly someone comes and tells me, we are going to do this better than you. I mean, it's say for example, a cricketer who's playing cricket professionally, they'll say, okay, tomorrow I can also play cricket better than Rohit Sharma. I'm thinner than Rohit. So probably I can play better than him also. That's if I believe that, then I should play for Mumbai Indians. That's my view on what the whole thing is. So I would urge you not to go with P2P. If you are willing to take a plier and pull out your teeth, then I'm happy if you want to go and invest in P2P.
Okay, thanks for that, Apayajit. We've actually run out of time, so we don't have time for any more questions. But you can meet, all the panelists offline and ask them any of your questions. Thanks so much.
I think they deserve a big round of applause. Please give a big round of applause for the panelists. I request them to please be seated for a minute. Friends, we have just concluded an incredibly insightful session on navigating lending and fintech landscape in India. In view of the success of this brilliant contribution of our esteemed panelists and moderators, on behalf of RVG alumni, we would like to express our deepest gratitude to Shri Aparajit, Shri Nitin, Shri Rajat, and Shri Vivek Bansal and Ms. Anushka for their invaluable insights in enriching our understanding on the important topic. As a token of our appreciation and respect, we would like to present memento to each of our distinguished panelists and moderator. I request Mr. Govind Sharma, Treasurer RVG alumni, to kindly come on the stage and present memento to Ms. Anushka Bhatia. Please give a big round of applause. I request Mr. Abhishek Agarwal next, RVG Alumni Committee member, to kindly come on the stage and present memento to Shri Aparajit Bhandarkar. Abhishek, please. Give a big round of applause, please. आपकी तालियां बजती रहें. Now I request Mr. Yogesh Patel, RVG Alumni Committee member, to kindly come and present memento to Shri Nitin Agarwal. जोरदार तालियों से स्वागत कीजिए. Next, I request Mr. Amit Malawat to kindly come on stage and present memento to Shri Rajat Bansal. Amit, please. To Rajat Bansal, Amit will present memento to Rajat Bansal. And now I request Mr. Yogendra Kheradi, Alumni Committee member, to kindly come on stage and present memento to Shri Vivek Bansal. Please give a big round of applause for all our panelists. So friends, with this, we conclude this our session of RVG Alumni Conclave, and I request everyone to please be seated. In next 5 minutes, we are going to start our next session of the conclave.